Hi, I'm Michael Weitzner, and I've been an architect in New York City for over 35 years. And today we're going to look at 3 outstanding New York buildings that were torn down and see what replaced them. Let's start with the iconic original Penn Station. So right away I noticed the main facade along 7th Avenue, these pedimented entrances north and south, which allow cars to enter in, and the central entrance for pedestrians, which is 6 Doric columns supporting a flat entablature with this medallion on top. In fact, all the columns are Doric, which is the simplest of the Greek orders. And the column spacing is based on Bernini's Piazza in Rome. So it's built in the Beaux-Arts style, which refers to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which was the most famous and most influential school of architecture at the time. And what Beaux-Arts style generally means is that it just refers to historic precedents, mainly classical style, Greek and Roman. And along those lines, you can see that this great waiting room that pops up above the rest of the building is actually based on the Baths of Caracalla from ancient Rome. The building was completed in 1910 by the great architectural firm of McKim, Mead & White. McKim, Mead & White were sort of the go-to architects of the Gilded Age. They designed many outstanding buildings, some of which still exist, including the Washington Square Arch, the library at Columbia University, and the library at NYU in the Bronx, which is now Bronx Community College. Penn Station was not only a great architectural triumph, but it was also an amazing engineering triumph because they had to build tunnels under the Hudson River. Before Penn Station was built, there were no tunnels under the Hudson River yet. You had to stop in Jersey City and then take a ferry across the Hudson River to get into Manhattan. But with the building of Pennsylvania Station, now you're entering into this unbelievably ornate and soaring space. Let's take a look at the interiors. So here we're looking at 2 different parts of the station. On the left, we're looking at the waiting room, and on the right, we're looking at the train shed from which people descended down to the platforms. So what jumps out at me right away is the vaulted coffered ceiling in the waiting room and the similar forms in steel on the right-hand side at the train shed. This one done in steel, this one done in stone. And instead of the coffers, which you see here in the stone, here it's these small panes of glass to let light in for the skylights. But you could see the same groin vaults being formed in both spaces. And then if we look directly into the waiting room, you see this huge entrances that come in and out from 7th and 8th Avenues. And you could also see the stairs that lead to 33rd and 31st Street at the ends, with these huge clerestory windows that let the light pour in. This coffered ceiling, all built out of travertine, quarried in Tivoli outside of Rome, which is also, by the way, the same stone they used to build the Colosseum in Rome thousands of years before. But the other thing that stands out is the incredible scale of this room. I mean, just look at the size of a pedestrian here. It's a great soaring space, and one of the greatest spaces, not only in New York, but probably in the world when it was built. So as one ascended from the train up into the station, your first point was this amazing skylit train shed, which was very reminiscent and influenced by the great train sheds of Europe. However, the shapes are still reminiscent of what we see in the stone-encased central waiting room. And so what's really interesting about all this steel is that this was the most advanced technical building that was done in this era of 1910 when it was completed. All the columns and all the beams and all the arches that you see are all built up out of these much smaller pieces that all get riveted together, and they form this beautiful lacy framework. And what's significant about this is that these 2 pieces of the building are actually more similar than what you can see, because in fact this beautiful stone room is actually a forgery. The stone is not holding up the room. It's actually being held up by steel. In fact, the same steel that holds up this great train shed at the rear along 8th Avenue. And what's also remarkable about this building is it was not built by the government. It was not built by the city. It was not built by the state. It was built by a private company. They owned the land, they owned the building, which is significant in terms of its demise. So unfortunately, this building only lived for 50 years. The decline of the railroads left the Pennsylvania Railroad Company on the brink of bankruptcy, and to survive, they actually had to sell the building to a developer, and thus the building was knocked down. And it's really tragic because this fantastic building had fallen on hard times and the maintenance of it had declined. But nonetheless, it was still one of the greatest buildings in New York City, and it's unfortunate that this had to be the sacrificial lamb. But because this building was demolished, the Landmarks movement began, and the Landmarks Preservation Commission was created. And today, this building would never have been permitted to be knocked down. And in fact, that's what saved Grand Central Station just a few blocks north.
New York's Pennsylvania Railroad Station has reached the end of the line. A landmark for tourist and native alike, the huge granite monument to the age of elegance is falling to the wreckers. There were organized movements to save this example of what architects call great American design. The underground tracks will remain, but the station with its famous clock will be replaced by a modern sports palace. The end of a landmark.
So this building was demolished in 1963. What stands where this train shed and this waiting room used to stand is the modern-day Madison Square Garden, which is actually the fourth version of Madison Square Garden. But let's take a look at the most iconic Madison Square Garden, which is actually the second iteration at its original site. So the first version of Madison Square Garden was actually built in the 1870s. The version we're going to look at now was actually built in the 1890s, also by McKim, Mead & White, but this was built by Charles McKim's partner, Stanford White, who not only designed it, but he also lived there and died there. And we'll talk about that later. So in this image on the right, we're looking at the building from Madison Square, looking to the northeast. This image on the left, it's actually Park Avenue right in front, and Madison Avenue is in the distance along 26th Street. So here's everything that jumps out at me. It's a Renaissance Revival building. It's built out of this buff brick that Stanford White was very fond of. And you could see this beautiful arcade that he included so people could stand out from under the weather when buying their tickets. And then you could see this loggia, which is another version of an arcade, but where the arcade at the bottom has these beautiful Renaissance arches. At the top, it's just columns supporting a flat entablature, and then there's a balustrade above it. And then he has these turrets, these domed pieces at the corner and mid-block. He has them as well, flanking the main entrance. If you look at the image on the left, you can see he also included a lot of terracotta ornament that he outlines the blind windows on the corner turrets with. So this image on the left gives you a really good idea of the scale, because the building runs from Park Avenue, which you could see in front with the trolley tracks, all the way to Madison Avenue, which is in the distance. So it's a really big building that encompasses an entire New York City block. So the main arena hosted a variety of events, including presidential convention, circus acts, boxing, as well as a velodrome for bicycle racing. And what was notable about the main arena as well is that it actually had a sliding skylight, which was really an amazing sort of amenity for the 1890s. One of the most salient features of this Madison Square Garden was this great tower, which is actually based on the Giralda Campanile at the cathedral in Seville in Spain. In fact, the whole building is based on Stanford White's love for Spanish architecture. And he wanted this tower as a sort of signpost for the building, so that people would see it along the skyline. And he also wanted to compete with Joseph Pulitzer and his New York World newspaper building, which was down at Park Row, for the tallest building in New York City. And to do that, he included a statue of the huntress Diana. And what I love about that is he based this on a tower that is at a cathedral in Spain. So where the cathedral is a tribute to God and religion, he puts a nude statue on top of his tower as a symbol of pleasure and entertainment. The investors did not want him to build this tower, and he really had to fight to get it built. And after they built it, they didn't know what to do with it. So to make money, they actually rented it out as apartments. And Stanford White rented one of those apartments, and he stayed there when his family was away. And Stanford White not only lived here, but he was actually murdered here. And on the roof, which you could see contained behind this arcade, was where the actual garden was, which was an outdoor sort of restaurant and cafe that also had shows. And that's where he was killed, by the husband of the woman he was having an affair with in 1906. This Madison Square Garden also had trouble making ends meet, and eventually was torn down in the 1920s and was replaced by the New York Life Insurance Building, which is still there to this day. So let's take a look at another building that also wanted to compete with Joseph Pulitzer and his New York World building, also designed by Stanford White. And that's the New York Herald building. So right away I noticed a few things. Let's just put the building in context. You could see the elevated train line along 6th Avenue here on the right, which is the east side of the building. You could see Broadway here on the left with the trolley cars. So on the main entrance facade, he creates this recessed entrance under the arcade, which is actually somewhat semicircular in plan. And then above it, there's this dual arched window. And above that are the bell ringers, which are actually printing press workers, and the statue of Minerva. The other thing that jumps out at me is all this wonderful terracotta decoration that sits between the windows. And the other thing the building has is this hip roof with a flat zone in the middle because the site is actually trapezoidal. And the arcade itself sits on this little platform, which is called a stylobate, which was used in many Greek temples. And the other thing that White did was he included this plaza out front, which still exists, known as Herald Square. So the New York Herald was started by James Gordon Bennett and then was inherited by his son, James Gordon Bennett Jr. And James Gordon Bennett Jr. saw the future of New York was moving northward. Before this, all the newspapers were at what's called Park Row, and all their buildings were there just next to City Hall downtown. So he decided to move northward to the intersection of Broadway and 6th Avenue, where they cross 36th Street, on this wedge-shaped site of what is now the eponymous Herald Square. James Gordon Bennett Jr. knew Stanford White from Newport, where all the rich people hung out at the turn of the century in Rhode Island. And in fact, White had designed the interiors for his yacht, and Bennett liked those designs, and so he asked him to design his new headquarters for his newspaper. And this building is actually not only inspired by pretty much a direct replica of the Loggia del Concilio in Verona. So the Loggia del Concilio is a Venetian Renaissance palazzo which was built in 1476. And that, in fact, is based on the Foundling Hospital by Brunelleschi, which was built in the 1420s in Florence. So at the Loggia del Concilio, where the architect there put statues along the edges above each pilaster, Stanford White put owls, which Bennett had asked him to do because he felt those sort of symbolized the wisdom of his newspaper. And those owls, actually, he placed electric green light bulbs in so that at night the eyes glowed. So the building was completely demolished by 1930, but some of its remnants you can still see today in Herald Square, including the statue of Minerva, the bell ringers, and some of the owls. So unlike the previous buildings we looked at, which were replaced by somewhat iconic buildings, this one was replaced by a very ordinary pedestrian office building, which at its base currently leases to a bank and a drugstore. So we've just looked at three great McKim, Mead & White buildings that no longer exist. And that was sort of the mindset in New York City at the turn of the century, that progress was king and that things were torn down and new things were rebuilt in their place. But if New York had been more historically minded, especially in the 1960s when Penn Station was brought down, some of these buildings might still be there. And as the New York Times stated after the demise of Penn Station, ultimately, we are judged not by the monuments we create, but by those we have destroyed. Let me know what other iconic demolished buildings you'd like to see discussed in the comments below.